Intros, when Peter gives us the go-ahead, since this is live and rehearsed, we'll bring Mark up, and then we'll read your introductions when Congressman McGovern, so that we can maximize our time. Since we're now officially up, we want to welcome those of you who are on the live feed today. Regardless of what you're hearing, the progressive community is alive and well in Washington, D.C., organized, functioning, and working. We're here at our Progressive Roundtable. We're honored to have Congressman Mark Pocan with us. He needs no introduction, but I have to for the one or two of you out there who may not know. We met Mark initially, many of us, during the little run-in with the governor out in Wisconsin. Mark was principally responsible for holding Governor Walker accountable during his time in the state legislature. Since then, has been elected now and serving in Congress. This is the seat that Tammy Baldwin used to hold. And the best thing I want to say to get things rolling today, to let you know how truly progressive he is, as if we don't already know. He was one of the first freshmen that came on board on 676, no questions asked, is leading the fight on TPP. When we were looking for folks to work with Alan Grayson and Barbara Lee to say no strike on Syria, he was front and center, has been, and will continue to be a spokesperson for the progressive community. And we're honored he's with us today to spend some time, not only to hear from him, but to hear from us, and more importantly, how we can get you back to work. Thank you and welcome.
No, thank you, Tim.
However you want to
I'm
do
moving
it.
right here.
Wherever you're
No, it
most
sounds good.
comfortable.
I can see
The
most
only
people.
thing is,
Sorry.
you got to be on top of the mic.
Gotcha. All right.
All set.
I will go on top of the mic. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. Been busy spending the morning at a oversight and government reform hearing on the IRS implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So the only thing we were missing for the perfect trifecta for the Republican Party is if we also had Benghazi in there, IRS, Benghazi, and Obamacare. They would have been very happy, but we got two of the three. So I'm really glad to be here. A couple of things that Tim had asked me to just give you updates on. I'd be glad to take questions as well. Is that how you operate, Tim? Or?
Please.
Sure. First of all, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as Fast Track, and then secondly on our constitutional right to vote amendment that Keith Ellison and I are doing. Specifically, let me start with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You probably saw yesterday the White House announced that they will have, they think by the end of the year, the negotiating done on the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. A lot of us have been working in a working group all year on this, kind of waiting for this moment, waiting for the Fast Track legislation that we expect, waiting to see what was going to be in this. I did have the very good opportunity just at the very beginning of August before we left to go in the district period to get a chance to look at some of the combined bracketed text, specifically in two areas, labor and procurement. Just for people who don't know, I mean, my background, I'm very close to labor. I've had a union printing shop for 25 years since I had hair for a long time, so I've been very active with the union movement, and those issues are very, very important to me on a wide front of issues, but also secondarily, I led for our freshman group the letter that we had sent originally about concern about the process, and I think 36 of our freshmen signed that letter. So we've been working very aggressively on this issue, and so the concern I had was on the labor front and then the procurement front, because one of the bills I had as a state legislator was a Buy American bill, which specifically made sure that we could have Buy American provisions in state law, and we had passed that in Wisconsin actually with a bipartisan vote back I guess it would have been 2009, I believe, when we did that, maybe 2009. So those two areas we've been kind of breaking out. I know Alan Grayson has taken some, Rose has taken some, and we're kind of looking at the language. What that combined bracket text lets us do is not just see what the U.S. government would like to have, but what's actually being negotiated, what's still undecided. They do it in a confidential way, so I couldn't even have staff in the room. I wasn't allowed to write down the language, although I got away with a little bit, but I did more notes about the general trends of it. And what I think I can tell you from what I saw, and especially in those two provisions, but from talking to the rest of our partners about it, is don't expect to see anything that's any improvement from any past trade deal. In Wisconsin, we've seen so many manufacturing jobs go overseas because of bad past trade deals. In my business, one of the things we help do is we source USA-made and union-made products, because we have a lot of customers who want that. And I've watched over 25 years that just diminish and diminish. So if you want to get a pen that's union-made in the USA, there's like 2 suppliers left in the country that do that. If you want to get a balloon printed, there's 1 supplier left in the country that can do that. If you want to get the pins that I'm wearing. I think there's 2 suppliers left in a country of over 300 million people that still do that. And a lot of that is directly related to a lot of the trade agreements that we have. So it's obviously of great concern. What I can tell you from looking at that language, when you try to bring a country like Vietnam into a trade agreement that has no minimum wage, has completely differing labor standards than what we have. You try to bring Japan in as you deal with auto provisions. You try to do any of what you'd expect to do on a labor front, and you're not going to do it too easily. And without going into the specifics, I can't say. What I can certainly tell you is if you just think about that, it's almost impossible to have any improvements from any past trade deal because you're dealing with countries that even have probably worse labor standards and conditions. So don't expect, from my guess, when they finish this negotiation, to have anything. You might see different language than's been used in the past, but it'll be the exact same. It's kind of like saying a half a dozen oranges or 6 oranges. You're going to have different words, but they're the exact same item. So I think that's what we expect on the labor side. And on the procurement side, unfortunately, I think you're going to see a lot of the same language that doesn't allow us to have those kind of laws that protect things like Made in America, that allow us to protect a lot of the things you might want to have in unique areas, unique states about various products they have. In Wisconsin, we're very close to dairy. When someone flew out to work on my campaign, the first place we took them to was this custard place that you can get a cheeseburger with deep fried cheese curds and have a shake with it, right? Like we covered every way you can do dairy. And so one of the provisions we look at is in New Zealand and dairy and what that means to a state like Wisconsin, which could have a lot of impact. So there's a lot of those things that you're going to find still are not going to be up to where any of us would like to. Now, beyond that, as you can imagine, just talking about food standards. Rosa DeLaura has been just awesome on talking about that. If she tells you about shrimp in some of these countries, you will never eat shrimp again. So there's definitely a lot of provisions that we're all watching as a team, various parts of, but we expect it not to be much better. So because of that, we're trying to anticipate the fast-track legislation that could come. Right now, we're working on the floor a letter that Rosa, again, has taken the lead on along with George Miller and Louise Slaughter. I think we've got 90 people so far on the letter, and we're doing all the outreach right now to the remaining 110, 111 people. So, and what the letter essentially gets at is just, talking about fast track and preserving congressional oversight when it comes to that. So it's a good list right now. It's going to get better. We just literally at the end of the day yesterday decided to start, working out to the other 110 folks. So my guess is that we'll be hopefully in a pretty good place at that. So let me offer that. And then do you want me to take questions?
No,
Okay.
please, I don't want to interrupt. Next Wednesday, people that will be watching will be going to their member of Congress office, have not signed the letter. So
Great.
we're going to hand deliver this to district office.
Great. And you might want to check in with Rosa's office right before you do, because then she can update it, because we're having everything go through Rosa's office on the letter. So that's kind of my very brief update on those two, and I'll take questions in a second. Let me give the update on the right to vote constitutional amendment. One of the issues that I had to deal with a lot as a Wisconsin legislator, and I used to serve on the campaign elections committee, was our efforts to make it harder for people to vote through the photo ID. Wisconsin, we're really proud. We have same-day registration. We have one of the top 3 percent of voters who turn out between Maine, Minnesota, and Wisconsin are always in competition with each other because who can have a greater amount of our citizenry get out. And when you saw measures like that come, I remember this is going back a decade ago, they said, oh my God, there's voter fraud. And we had an extensive hearing to find voter fraud. And at the end of a day, after about 8 hours of hearing, there was one nice, recent citizen, senior citizen who couldn't vote in Milwaukee County. But if that's the extent of voter fraud, in fact, our head of our elections board said there were about a 10-year period, about 40 cases that they had of voter fraud, of which the majority of them were felons voting, which almost every provision that we've talked about doesn't really address a felon voting. So I followed this very closely. So when we came to this year and coming to Congress, one of my good friends is John Nichols. He's also from Madison. We're very proud of John being another hometown person. We got talking about things, and we thought, boy, it'd be really great to have what Jesse Jackson Jr. used to have and really put out there and talk now especially about a constitutional right to vote. And what we found, and it's really amazing, is when you become a citizen, they ask you, what's your most important right as an American? And the answer is the right to vote. And yet in that Constitution, there is no explicit right to vote. It's certainly implied. There are amendments that work against discrimination on voting, but there is no explicit right. So because there is no explicit right, one of the problems we have in states that have photo ID laws, that have long lines to vote, that have shorter early voting or making it harder to register, those kind of requirements, is the person in that state has to prove they've somehow been wronged by a law change, rather than the opposite. If you had a constitutional amendment, that state would have to prove they haven't wronged someone by doing that new law change. So it's really important, and just what we've seen since the Supreme Court case this year that kind of opened up in some of these states the provision about some of the voting standards. There's 81, or let me just double check, 82 laws in 31 states right now, just this year, that have been introduced to make it harder for people to vote. So what we wanted to do is our part of the conversation is say, look, bottom line, this is something we should have. And if you think about it, when the Constitution was written, there's a good reason why you didn't have it, because 20% of the people voted. White male property owners over 21. Were eligible. So they didn't have it at the time of writing the Constitution, but certainly where we've moved to as a country is the place that every single person has that, should have that right. And, for me, I like to say the one thing I'm ever going to have in common, that my brother and I have in common with the Koch brothers, is we're going to have that one vote. No matter what, they have one vote, and I and my brother have one vote. So it's really important as a great equalizer for democracy so that everyone has that access. And if you haven't had a chance to read John Nichols and Bob McChesney's most recent book, Dollarocracy, I would recommend that. It's not a commercial plug, but it's a great book. And one of his final answers that he has on how to restore democracy is that constitutional right to vote. So we are right now, I think, at 22. Thank you. Sponsors on that, and we're continuing to have that grow. We're trying to work with partners to continue to make that grow. But I think it's one of the things actually that I enjoy talking about the most as we talk with folks nationally, is that it really is that fundamental need that all these other issues that we can talk about and all the other issues that we care about still come down to that access to being able to have every single person have their voice, and that is through the vote. And we're going to continue to build that coalition and continue to work on that. And I think there's something we're going to be doing with Jesse Jackson Sr. in November around that, and we're trying to continue to build on that, and we'll keep you abreast of anything around that front. So with that, Tim, I'd just as soon open it up to any questions people might have and try to answer the best I can.
We first have to give you your door prize. We were moving so quickly.
All right.
This is your official corporations are not people
Oh,
button.
thank you.
So now you're official.
Appreciate
The
it.
PDA
Thank you.
Before we open it up a little bit, you outlined the dangers of TPP. Can you also, we had Laura Wallach here last month, on the urgency on fast tracking, why it's so important that people understand and we really stop the fast tracking, and then we'll throw it open a little bit from your perspective.
Sure. Well, and Lori Wallach's been awesome, who, by the way, is another Wisconsin native. Not that I'm just going to keep plugging Wisconsin, but
John Nichols would be very proud.
I know. We have a tendency to do that. We got the Packers, we got the Badgers. We're very proud of
Chiefs,
things.
anybody?
I know, exactly. I haven't plugged beer yet, but we'll get to it. But Lori's been tremendous to work with and been very helpful for me as we've being a freshman, and this is an issue that's new as far as congressional ability to do something, but we've certainly talked about aspects of it back home. The problem with fast track, obviously, is if you pass a fast track bill, you're going to take away Congress's say to have any influence on these changes. So while I told you it has taken, I think, a pretty concentrated effort by among a number of us to even get to see the combined bracketed text, because they don't show that to us. We don't have any input during the negotiation. The chance we have is when they give the contract to Congress for approval, and if you give us fast track, you take away Congress's ability to then have that influence. So you've basically made us almost as irrelevant as a moderate Republican is right now during this fight that we're having on the government closure. So it would be nice. It's a visual. It just helps.
Didn't get past me. That was good.
But it would be valuable for us, obviously, to have that say. And if fast track does come up, while every president, and I don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican, certainly wants to do that because they can skip a branch of government, we can't. And we are going to work with Democrats and Republicans. And I'll tell you, some of the very same people who are closing down government right now will probably be allies in some other time on this fight, because we want to make sure that Congress has a say. And that may be where we quit agreeing on things, but at least we're going to bring it to the point that Congress has that ability to say something.
Thank you. Great opportunity. Just introduce yourself to the congressman. Questions? Stephen?
Yeah, hi. I live in Virginia. Stephen Spitz is my name again. And Virginia is one of 4 states that you can't vote if you have a felony conviction for the rest of your life unless the governor restores your right to vote. What would the amendment do to that situation?
Now you're on the stump.
Yep. No. This was a conversation we had. We kept it explicitly that everyone would have a right to vote. Now, a state could try to do something different, but with our constitutional amendment, it's recognized that everyone has that right to vote. So I know every state by state, it's greatly varies. In Wisconsin, once you're off paper, you can vote. Some people can never vote. Some people can vote, I think, even if they are a felon in some states. But it's a wide enough variety that we didn't address it. We said every U.S. citizen has a constitutional right to vote, period. And that's what the amendment addresses specifically in our language.
I'm going to do my best, Phil Donahue now. Watch this. If people contribute more, we're going to get 2 mics for next month. Questions for the congressman, excuse me. Questions? One of the things we learned on the last podcast. Questions? You can't let him off this easy. Really? Here we go. Thanks.
Hi, Len Mel. I wanted to ask the strategy to start fighting against Fast Track, how elaborate it is and how we could help.
So I think I kind of inferred this, but I didn't say it specifically. We are working with people on both sides of the aisle, separately but equal, I guess would be the way to put it, letting them approach Republican to Republican, and we're approaching Democrat to Democrat. But I just think it's a better strategy. So rather than having us try to do a bunch of joint letters, you're going to see Republican letters on something and Democratic letters on something. But I think it helps because we've got some Republicans that are working with us right now that didn't on past trade deals. So I think you're going to have a marriage of people who want to make sure, on the right anyway, that Congress has its authority. We're going to have a mixture of the people that unfortunately don't like President Obama, and that's their sole guiding principle. But you're really dealing with the people who want to make sure that our legislative branch has some oversight. And there are folks, again, that have not been supportive in the past who are supportive, and they're working their angle. And on the Democratic side, we're doing the same thing. So right now I'm working a lot of the freshmen because that's probably the best affinity group I have. And we've broken it out among Mike Michaud and Rosa Delar and others of us who are working on this, George Miller and others, to make sure Louise Slaughter and a bunch of us are on that working group, that we're going to get as many people possible. One of the challenges we do have is specifically on freshmen. I think a lot of times what we saw from the last letter we did is freshmen are just a little bit more reluctant to jump onto something because they're new, and quite honestly, they get a lot of advice on another shoulder from people telling them to go slow and don't necessarily jump onto something. But this is real. If we have Fast Track, I think it's a very different issue. You can not necessarily have an opinion on the trade deal, but you can certainly have an opinion about whether or not Congress should have that oversight. So we are working at the strategy level, Democrats and Republicans, but working separately on the execution of that strategy.
Oh, slow sort in the room having to do this. Hang on. Here we go. Can you just introduce yourself for the folks at home? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Melinda St. Louis. I work with Lori Wallach at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. And I just wanted to make a comment about the summit that just happened in Indonesia. The Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. There was a TPP summit on the side of it that President Obama was not able to attend due to the shutdown. And it's been interesting. The press reports that have come out have said that that they remain on track to finish TPP. However, the actual statement of the leaders took out the deadline of this year, which I thought was significant. I think that it looks that the big controversies remain in the negotiations, and just I was just curious if you have a sense of timing of Fast Track. I mean, given the context of the government shutdown and all of the, is there anything that we need to be thinking about in terms of timing?
I think the working group on this, I mean, we're just moving on it like we assume it could come before the end of the year, right? The fact the president said it's going to be executed by then, although I have to admit, when I saw the language, those are big gaps that are left, really big gaps that either Vietnam is going to greatly, significantly improve labor conditions and standards, or we are going to have to go down to meet them. So I'm not sure if end of the year is an absolute date, but that's what the White House said yesterday. So we're assuming that it's coming up this year. We're organizing around it. But given the current environment, I don't think any of us can honestly predict what's going to happen day to day. The most recent thing I've been told when I talk to Republicans privately is we're going to be slow walking the shutdown right up to the 17th. They think they have more leverage. So, this delays everything that we can possibly be working on during this time period. So I don't know if I can give you any kind of an honest, definitive answer, but we're preparing as if it's coming up right away, and I think by doing that, we'll be ready when it does.
Mark, one last question. Many of us this past weekend were at the national gathering at Healthcare Now. Given the mess that we find ourselves in, part of the problem we believe was that the Congressional Progressive Caucus kind of got lost on single payer, got caught up in public option. As a freshman, it was something you did early on to come on to 676. This coming Wednesday, while we're getting signatures on the letter for TVP, will be a national call-in day to remind our friends on the Hill to get back to single payer. Can you, in the short time you've been up here, just kind of share with folks that are listening the importance to call into Congress on Wednesday and to deliver that letter in regards to 676? Sure.
Especially now, because I think we're all kind of in this holding pattern. The more messages you give us right now are really helpful because we're around and we're waiting and there's not much going on for us to do. So it's an especially good time to send a message. So people, coming around will be helpful. Granted, most of our heads are probably going to be around the closure down and the debt ceiling, as absurd as the debt ceiling is, in my opinion. But make that point. It's really important to let people know where you stand. We're right now kind of defending the Affordable Care Act, but we feel like the fact that the public supports us strongly on the major provisions, whether it be no pre-existing condition limitation, no overall cap on expenditures, adult children not until 26, preventive care, men being charged the same as women. I mean, those are all strongly supported by the public, and any implementation that needs improvement, we're open to improvement. But it just started 9 days ago, and I just sat through this hearing again where they try to blame absolutely everything on the Affordable Care Act. But I also sat through an interesting workshop this morning on polling, and it really showed the Affordable Care Act is one of those unique issues that combines the entire Adams family that makes up the Republican Party, from evangelicals to Tea Parties to just kind of mainstream Republicans and every other creature in between. There really is a connecting entity of the Affordable Care Act. So part of why I think they've pushed this issue as far as they have is because it clearly they see it as unifying those groups. The problem is when it comes to the moderate Republicans, they also see this, what they're doing right now is way too extreme, way too far, and for independents. So strategically, I know I'm taking a little liberty going beyond your question, but I did want to offer that because I found that very interesting. I mean, there's a reason why they're fighting this fight is because it does combine their many different and diverse parts of their party. But in the end, if we had a single payer system, all of these other questions that they're trying to throw into play, why there's going to be a problem on this or problem on that, wouldn't exist. So it's important to keep that in front of folks so they know that as much as we're really glad Affordable Care Act is a big leap forward, there's more to do to make sure that everyone's got coverage.
Lori's got the last question, and we're right on schedule.
I think we're all kind of aghast at the spectacular dysfunction that's going on right now in Washington. And it does seem to us at NNU that just talking about kind of which social obligations we're going to give up on or cut traps progressives and Democrats in the wrong frame. There really needs to be a discussion of revenues. And that's why we've backed the Inclusive Prosperity Act, and we thank you for your co-sponsorship of that. And we would appreciate it if members would start talking about the need for revenues and breaking out of this kind of framing of scarcity. We know the austerity debate was misleading at best. We know that we actually have money in this country to solve our pressing social needs, and we know where the money is. It's in the banks. And so, they never paid their fair share for the economic situation that they caused. We think there's a clear moral, political argument to be made at this moment in particular about kind of how to get us out of this morass. We're also having a briefing on the 30th that I wanted to mention to you that we've been invited to join us for, and we'd love to have your participation on the morning of the October 30th.
For those at home and you National Nurses United, sometimes we get inside the blank here.
No, I got to tell you, one of the most interesting things is coming to Congress and learning the level of dysfunction that exists. And then, really, I feel like, and I've said this on the floor, I feel like I serve in the nation's largest kindergarten, only we have access to the federal checkbook and the nuclear arsenal. It's a little bit scary and intimidating at that point. But I think what the Democrats have been trying to say very consistently is if we did what we have asked for, the Senate's asked for 19 times, I think we've asked for 3 times specifically on the floor, but we've asked for the last 6 months, is let's have the Republican leadership appoint conferees to have a budget. I used to serve on our budget committee back home. We've been 4 years without a budget. You need to have that in place so you don't do these short term stopgap solutions. And part of the proposal the Democrats have had, especially to get rid of the sequester, has been talking about revenues. We're more than willing to show where there's plenty of places you can do that. So I think that will be part of a discussion once we get to that point. I think right now what we're still doing is educating the public on just the damage of a shutdown and even the bigger damage of the debt ceiling if we were to not pay our obligations and what that would do. So I think what you're going to find, and we're going to continue doing, is probably talking about that a little more on the floor right now, because we're trying to really set up the case for how bad this is and why negotiating with a gun to your head is not the way to negotiate. But if they're willing to, Keith and I and others in the Progressive Caucus, none of us want to keep the sequester in place. And yet we're agreeing to, for 6 weeks, these levels only to have us sit down so we can have that conversation. I will likely never vote for anything that continues the sequester after that. There's certainly other things I won't do either, including change CPI and other stuff that we would never vote for if it's in there. But we have to, thank you, but we have to first make sure we made the full case so that people understand is the more pressure they get, the more moderate Republicans who back home say they'll vote for a clean CR and then maybe act differently here. If they get that pressure because we're talking about it, I think that's the best thing we can do first. But that second step, we're already continuing to have that conversation, and we will once we have a chance to sit down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we thank Mark for taking the time with this busy time? And we will see you in the halls and in the
Absolutely.
streets.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, if we can, we're going to try to keep the ship moving on time. We're going to bring our peace and justice folks up. Stephen, Judith, if we can. Miriam's already up here. We're on the agenda now. We want to talk a little bit about the work that, since we were last here, last night we had a great webcast that Judith LeBlanc from Peace Action helped us organize. Stephen, many of you recognize Miriam from previous roundtables. So if we could, Judith, why don't we pass the mic down to you? If you could introduce yourself, and we'll move to the portion of the agenda to talk a little bit about where we are in regards to diplomacy in Syria. Also, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, I'm sorry, turn. We need you up here. Come on, too. I'm sorry.
No, I'm listening. You guys go ahead.
All right. Congresswoman Barbara Lee's office is in the House as well. So we want to update, if we could, a little bit on Syria diplomacy. The missiles have not flown into Damascus since we last met, so diplomacy is holding. But we have a big threat coming around the corner. So Judith, if you could, by way of introduction, maybe talk a little bit about Syria. And then Stephen, as everybody knows with the Win Without War, who was at the panel last night, can share with us just when we're ready to take a small victory, what's coming around the corner. And Miriam's been very busy on the conversion front. And kick it off, if you could, Judith, share with folks.
Well,
Thank you. Welcome, everybody.
Well, my name is Judith LeBlanc, and I am the field director for Peace Action. I'm a little bit on the back foot, but last night we had a really successful teach-in, an online live stream teach-in. We went through such an amazing push not only in our country but around the world, to try to prevent U.S. military action in Syria. And we wanted to draw out some lessons for movement building here in the U.S. and how we can build a movement that can fundamentally demilitarize U.S. foreign policy, to put our front foot on diplomacy rather than military force. And so we put together a great panel: Stephen from Win Without War, Nick Burning from MoveOn.org, the communications director, and Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. And the great thing is that we were able to bring together a number of national groups and have somewhat of an infrastructure nationally of groups that have worked together over the last 10 years, really. First to try to prevent the war in Iraq, and then continuing to press to end the war in Iraq and to end the war in Afghanistan. So when we brought groups together back in June, our sole purpose was to build support for the fact, for the Obama administration, that they were resisting the push for military action. So when the administration shifted their footing, we were already working together and had already collected, I think, how many signatures on our joint petitions?
For Syria?
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands of signatures. We knew we had public support, so we jumped into action. And frankly, this victory was not simply that of the anti-war movement. It was an anti-war movement of the 21st century, it included the right wing, and it included a broad cross-section of groups that do not focus on foreign policy. Why? Because the people in this country have learned over the last 10 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that war is not a good thing, that people are not war weary, they're war wise, because they know the economic and human impact of wars is something that continues to drive our economy into the ditch right now, and also has human consequences both for those who fight the wars and those who live in the countries where the wars are fought. So at this point, Stephen is much more on the scene in the sense of what's going on in Congress, but it doesn't look like we're going to be revisiting military action in Syria, and things are proceeding on the ground there. The question is, what will happen what can the U.S. do to be a part of helping to end the civil war in Syria? And the national network of groups, many of the groups are in this room who are part of this national network that put together the teach-in and worked on these petitions. We have created steps that the U.S. can take to promote peace in Syria, things that we think the administration should do to keep diplomacy on the front burner and to play a constructive role in bringing together the countries in the region to support the efforts of the Syrian people to regain control of their country, their government, but also their economy.
If we, in our spontaneous and unrehearsed manner, live from the Capitol, thank you, Judith. We're going to hold here, and we're honored. Again, somebody that has been with us at the roundtables. Many of you out there know Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. When we talk about the buildup and where our friends were in Congress, there literally were only 5 or 6 we could count on one hand who was out front with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and one of those was Jim McGovern. Many of you also remember at the roundtable, he was the one that began the drumbeats on the food stamp program, and since then, there's been a lot happening on that food stamp front, in addition to everything else. So we're honored that Jim could find time to be with us. So we're going to bookmark it here. If we could get Congressman Jim McGovern to join the panel, and please welcome Congressman Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. Hey Jim, how are you, buddy? My Congress member, full disclosure. Wherever you want to be.
Right here?
Yeah, be to my left.
All right.
Welcome.
Well, happy to be here.
Can someone be to your left?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for all that you do. I'm looking around this room and I see a lot of friends who have been involved in a lot of important causes, and I think I can safely say that you've made a difference. And I'm coming in on the conversation on Syria, but I believe that it was grassroots pressure that helped keep us out of war. Because I was, at the beginning there, I thought war was inevitable. Nobody was talking about alternatives, and nobody was even asking questions. And then PDA did a great ad in the was it roll call, right, there it is.
Please.
There it is. Absolutely.
$8,000, that's a lot of grassroots money.
But also the grassroots, Win Without War, a whole, a number of organizations here came together, and look, I think we averted what I think would have been a catastrophe. Now we have an agreement to rid Syria of chemical weapons. We have a Security Council resolution, which I think strengthens the UN, and hopefully we will start using the United Nations more to solve some of these international issues. And at the end of the day, the world will have a concrete result, which is there'll be no more chemical weapons. And that's a good thing. So I want to thank everybody here for the work that you have done in that, and on that. Look, we're meeting amidst the government shutdown. We don't know whether we're going to default on our financial obligations. This place is insane at this moment. And I used to preface all my remarks by saying that John Boehner's a reasonable guy, that he's just being pulled in the wrong direction by some extremist elements of his own party. But at some point, you can't make excuses anymore. At some point, you become part of the problem. And it is really important that Speaker Boehner stand up to the Ted Cruz wing of his party, and do what's right. We have, and that is to bring to the floor a clean continuing resolution. And let's be honest, as I'm a liberal, I hate the sequester numbers in the continuing resolution. They're too low. I've been against those sequester numbers from the very beginning. But look, to keep the government running for a few weeks, we've been living with those numbers. I live with them another 5 weeks to give us time to work out a long-term agreement, so that we can fix some of these numbers and get maybe a better deal for the American people. But the Republicans, even when they win, that's not enough. They keep on asking for more and more and more. And in this case, they wanted to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And now they're talking about going back after Social Security, after Medicare, this whole litany of stuff. So, we're going to have to stand, together and make sure that, that we don't let them get away with the dismantling of the entire public sector and the dismantling of the social safety net. So we have to be vigilant, because sometimes even amongst our friends, in an effort to get a deal, sometimes you get a bad deal. I want a deal as much as everybody else does, but I don't want a bad deal. I'll settle for an okay deal, but not a bad deal. And so we need to be careful of that. The one final thing I'll talk about, and then we can talk about whatever you else want to talk about here, is the issue of the food and nutrition programs, and particularly SNAP. The original Farm Bill came to the floor, did not pass. It had a $20 billion cut in SNAP. They decided to separate the nutrition section of the Farm Bill from the kind of the subsidy and other programs. They passed the subsidies and other programs of the Farm Bill, and then came back with a separate nutrition bill that didn't cut SNAP by $20 billion. It cut it by $40 billion. If that stands, 3.8 million people will lose their benefits. Hundreds of thousands of kids will lose their free breakfast and lunch program because they'll no longer be eligible for it. 170,000 veterans will be thrown off of SNAP. I mean, we've gotten into these wars that I think are awful, but nonetheless, we have sent some incredibly wonderful men and women over to fight in these wars, and some of them have come back with, with injuries, not only and post-traumatic stress syndrome, and a whole litany of challenges, and a lot of them have needed help. The idea that you could throw 170,000 veterans off of a food program is just beyond comprehension, and yet that's what this would do. I've been pushing the White House, so far unsuccessfully, to do a White House conference on food and nutrition, because I do believe that we can end hunger in this country, and I think it would be a lot easier to kind of remind people of the importance of programs like SNAP and WIC, by the way, which was also cut. If we could tie it all together into a holistic approach to how do you end hunger in this country, and we're working with the administration, hopefully, that we can get them to do that. I think that would be helpful. But I also want to thank PDA because during the fight on food stamps, they won, but only by a handful of votes. It was very, very close, and we even got some Republicans to stand with us. And I just believe that in the United States of America, the richest, most powerful nation on this planet, nobody ought to be hungry. I believe food should be a right for everybody in the world. But the notion that in this country you got people that are hungry is something that I think all of us should be ashamed of. And it is solvable, which makes it even more maddening. Some of the issues that you were talking about here and how do you solve conflicts overseas, I'm not sure I got all the answers for. I can tell you how you end hunger in America. And I remind people all the time that hunger is a political condition. I mean, we have the food, we have the infrastructure, we have everything but the political will. But you guys helped a lot. You pushed back a lot in a meaningful way, and we came very, very close. And now the Farm Bill is may be going to conference, and we're going to have to, work with our Senate colleagues and sympathetic House colleagues who may be on that conference committee to make sure that we try to fix what damage the House did on that. But in any event, I just want to thank all of you for all that you do, and I hope we get through this next week in one piece, and we don't default on our debt, and we don't make the economy worse for people, and we actually do what we were sent here to do, and that is make people's lives better. So, someone asked me, am I hopeful? I am hopeful in the sense that I think that as crazy as these guys are, they can't be that crazy. So that's my hope. Yeah. So, but we will see. Anyway, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jim. Do you have a couple minutes?
Yeah.
We didn't give you your official button before you came in. Could you, before we pass around, just share with folks a little bit of your efforts, Citizens United, and the work you're doing there? Mark Pocan, Congressman Pocan, also got his button and shared with us, and a little bit of your efforts legislatively on your amendments to share with folks.
Well, first of all, also thank you for the work you've done on campaign finance reform and on a bill that I have that basically would be an amendment to the Constitution, making it clear that corporations are not people. Corporations don't breathe. They don't get sent to Afghanistan to fight in wars. They are not people. They are artificial entities that people create. People have rights, and people's rights should trump the rights of corporations. It is that simple. And unfortunately, through a number of court decisions, people are losing their rights to corporations. So we need to push back on that. The Supreme Court's also going to be deciding a case about that would allow more money into political campaigns. And a number of people here were at that rally yesterday at the Supreme Court pushing back. Look, one of the problems with Washington here is that money plays too big of a role in campaigns. It's just that simple. And when corporations and, well-moneyed special interests can donate unlimited amounts of money to political campaigns, it corrupts the system. When people always ask me all the time, why is it that they cut food stamps, but you can't cut taxpayer subsidies to big oil companies? One of the reasons why, I believe, is because big oil companies send a lot of money to political parties. Not just Republicans, they send them to Democrats too. And so if we could take that money out of politics and empower more grassroots-oriented, movements, I think all of our priorities change. I think healthcare gets better. I think we're in a better spot to get to single payer. I think if we can take the money out of politics, we can, we could actually put the emphasis of government where it should be, and that is on people who need help, people who are in the middle class, and people who are struggling to get in the middle class. Donald Trump doesn't need government; he's fine, But there are a lot of people that do, and we ought not to be making people's lives more miserable. And I'll just say one final thing about campaign finance reform. And look, there's something really wrong with the fact that members of Congress of both parties have to spend so much time raising money. I mean, when you have to raise, it's not hundreds of thousands of dollars anymore. It's millions of dollars every 2 years. You're on the phone. You're asking people to, to give you contributions, and that's time away from committees. That's time away from, listening to your constituents. Time away from legislating and studying and reading. You're asking people for money. It's just not healthy for the system. And there are really good people here, but I don't think you would be human if you weren't influenced by the fact that if, let's say, an oil company came to you and said, "I'm going to raise you $250,000 for your campaign." You get elected, and then you got to vote on whether you should take away taxpayer subsidies to big oil companies. And you think, you know what, the right vote is to take it away. But God, I get $250,000 from these guys, and they got to raise I need another $250,000 for the next campaign. Maybe I'll take a walk on this one, or maybe I'll feel compelled to vote with the people that gave me all this money. You don't want members of Congress to be in that situation. You want them to be able to say, is it right that taxpayer dollars go to big oil companies that are making record profits, or should that money be spent someplace else? That's the debate you want to have happen, but that's not happening here. And so the bad news is that there were a number of bills that have been introduced that have not been scheduled for any hearings in this Congress. We have a Democratic group that works on these issues on campaign finance reform. We have some really good ideas. If we can take control of this place, I think we can move this up on the agenda and actually get some floor action. But right now, one of the advantages of being in power is you get to schedule what goes on the floor, what doesn't. Corporations are not people is not on John Boehner's top 10 list. It's not even on his top 1 million list. And in fact, corporations have been very, very good to John Boehner and to the Republican Party. And so they will go to their way not to do anything to dismantle that. But this fight on campaign finance reform and getting money out of politics, it is one of the most important battles that grassroots, the grassroots has to deal with, because we need to make it so that movements like this are more influential than somebody writing out a check. And so I'll just close. I think that there's a vote going on by just saying that one of the things I appreciate about a PDA is that you not only talk the talk, but you walk the walk. So you do the grassroots organizing, you do the phone calls, you do the letters, you do the meetings, and it's making a difference. And it is countering all this other stuff that's coming in. And so whether it's on keeping us out of war in Syria, whether it's helping protecting the SNAP program or the WIC program, or whether it's kind of leading the effort on trying to bring some common sense into our campaign finance system, you guys have been out there. And so I am really grateful that you're there. I always tell you, the wind at my back, at our backs, you're like the hurricane at our backs. I remind people of that.
You've made it with the official PD for
it did. Because sometimes it gets awful lonely here on these issues, and you're creating political space up here for a lot of members to feel comfortable to start talking about this stuff. So anyway. I like you guys a lot. So, all right.
Congressman Jim McGovern. Thank you, Jim. Well, that was worth interrupting you, wasn't it? All right. We'll put the needle back down where we were. Stephen, thank you.
It's always dangerous to try to follow a congressman. So actually, I'll start where I was going to end, since Congressman McGovern was just talking, which just is to say that I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this week was the 12th anniversary of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. It's a war that's gone on by all accounts far too long, but it's also a war that's not over. There's about 60,000 U.S. troops, give or take, still in Afghanistan right now. That number is going down to around 34,000 by February, but there's no clear plans on where it goes from there. And it's worth noting in the midst of all of our fiscal fights and all the conversations we're having over $40 billion in SNAP, and that's over, I think, 10 years, that we're spending $80 billion this year in Afghanistan still. We'll spend tens of billions of dollars next year in Afghanistan, and we're likely to spend tens of billions of dollars in Afghanistan for at least another decade. And it's a really tragic state of affairs, and it's helpful that we have folks like Congressman McGovern and groups like PDA that have been helping to fight that here in Washington. Back to what we were talking about before the congressman came in, one of the things that I wanted to flag really quick that came out of the Syria debate is that it was first and foremost a huge victory. And I've been fond of saying this is exactly how democracy is supposed to work. There was an issue, the president put the question before Congress, Congress put the question before their constituents, and their constituents said, "Oh dear God, no." In one of the loudest voices that's spoken out across the party lines. I was struck when you see folks like Jason Chaffetz from the reddest of red states, and folks like Jim McGovern, who saying the same thing, that all of my constituents are telling me, not most, not some, all of my constituents are telling me, don't do this. That says something about where the public was. And Congress listened and the votes weren't there. And to his credit, the president jumped at the chance for a diplomatic opportunity when it became available. But a dangerous thing's happening, and we talked about this a little bit last night for those who were there, which is that there's a kind of a conventional wisdom sinking in Washington that really the story of what happened in Syria is, forget all that democracy stuff, forget all that people not wanting to go to war thing. What really happened is we said we were going to bomb somewhere, and then something good happened. And so maybe what we should do is say we're going to bomb somewhere else, I don't know, Iran, and something good will happen there. This is a really dangerous theory of how diplomacy works, needless to say, not the least of which because you end up actually, usually in those circumstances, bombing the place. This was the exception rather than the rule. But I bring it up because it's actually not just kind of a crazy theory that a couple of people here in Washington have. It's becoming the conventional wisdom, and it's now being put into legislation. Congressman Franks has a bill that he's putting together and dropping that would wrap itself in the flag of diplomacy. The bill is called something absurd like the U.S.-Iran Diplomacy Act, but then what it actually does is declare war on Iran. And it does it in like Section 4 of the bill. And it says, we're not really saying it's war, but if all this other stuff fails, have at it, Mr. President, bomb them as much as you want. It's a crazy idea, but it's one that's getting legs. It's one that Senator Lindsey Graham is talking about emulating in the Senate, and it's one that we're going to have to fight pretty soon. So when it comes to that, I think it's worth just noticing that that's what's coming down the pike, and we're gonna have to deal with that sooner rather than later. But I think it's also worth noting that diplomacy is just getting started with Iran. When the president talked to President Rouhani, the new Iranian president, on the telephone, that was the first time in 34 years an American president had talked to an Iranian president. That's the beginnings of diplomacy. That's the beginning of talking. That's not the end process. But there's a lot of folks in Washington who now want to say, nah, diplomacy's over. It failed. We gave it a good shot. Talking once in 34 years isn't really a good shot. That's kind of the beginnings of a good shot. So just a little bit of patience, and we're going to need to give members of Congress the backbone on this to know that they have our support for supporting diplomacy. They're going to get a lot of pressure to say, don't support diplomacy, talk tough. The only thing that works is threats of force. The weird favorite thing in Congress is to say that they're playing bad cop to the president's good cop in one of the most troubling buddy cop routines that's ever been invented. But they need to hear from constituents. They need to hear from people who live in their districts who say, we want you to support diplomacy with Iran. We don't want an Iranian nuclear weapon any more than anybody else, but we recognize that the way we get that is through a diplomatic solution. Just like we could not have gotten rid of the Syrian chemical weapons with a couple bombs. We could have maybe destroyed a couple missiles, maybe destroyed a little bit of a factory here or there. But the only way you actually get rid of that weapons program is what we're doing right now, which is diplomacy, sending in weapons inspectors, destroying the weapons, destroying the munitions. That's the only thing that's going to work in Iran too. We could launch some bombs into Iran. It might make us feel good. We all would get to watch on CNN as they would have all sorts of fantastic graphics and things would be exploding, but it wouldn't actually stop the program. The only way that the program is going to stop is going to be diplomacy, and Congress is going to need support to make that happen. The last thing I want to flag, and this will be a good segue to Miriam, is that Congress, despite, as Congressman McGovern was talking about, is a completely broken place right now. But out of their desperation, some are kind of returning to this theory of a grand bargain, kind of a zombie. It's like a zombie deal. It won't go away. It's died I don't know how many times now. But it's troubling to see it come back up. I saw, I think Social Security Works is in the room. A grand bargain is kind of a collection of horrible ideas that get put together and sold as something great. That's not anything that's going to solve our problems here in Washington. And it's very dangerous to hear members of Congress talking about that again. From my particular perspective, as somebody who focuses on how much wasteful spending there is at the Pentagon, the only reason there's a grand bargain is to shovel money back into the Pentagon. And the only way you do that is by further cutting things like WIC, SNAP, non-defense discretionary spending, or, and most likely in this case, in addition, you also cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. This is a really troubling problem. It's something that's popping up. It needs to get pushed back down from whence it came. It needs to be reminded to members of Congress that no one supports this, that we don't want to see the Pentagon get more money and pay for that by cutting Social Security, Medicare. I do find it odd that personally that Republicans are saying, you know, shutting down the government over Obamacare is going so great for us, so let's default on our debt so that we can cut, unless we can cut Social Security. I don't think that's an any more winning strategy for them, but that's what they're saying when they say, unless we get, they wrap it up in this really nice, unless we get reforms to direct mandatory spending that's crushing our debt. What they're really saying is, unless you cut Social Security and Medicare and you let us put money back into things like the Pentagon, we're going to drive this country over an economic cliff and destroy not just the American economy, but the global economy. That's a horrifying concept. I think stopping that in some ways starts with pointing out things like, guess what? The Pentagon had its budget cut. We didn't all die. We were still able talking about going to war. They weren't even going to ask for a supplemental. They had plenty of money to go to war. We're still fighting a war in Afghanistan. We're doing just fine with that level of funding in the Pentagon. And in fact, we could probably cut a little bit more out of that so that we could put some money back into the vital programs that we needed in. So I just wanted to flag that as my last point, and I will turn it to Miriam, I guess.
Perfect segue. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks. Okay, so just a few pieces of news from the economic conversion beat. So back in August, I talked in this group about a law that was passed earlier in the year in Connecticut, setting up a commission innocuously called an act on Connecticut's future. But really, front and center in that bill is a mandate that this broad-based commission come up with a plan to diversify Connecticut's overly defense-dependent economy. And so now the news I bring is that my home state of Maryland has drafted its own bill quite similar to the Connecticut bill, spearheaded by Peace Action, and I'm helping. So this bill is really well written, I think, and has some sponsors in the Maryland State Legislature that are on really important committees for the sake of this bill. And so when this process moves a little further down the line, we are definitely going to be reaching out to PDA members in Maryland to push it, to build support for this planning process in Maryland. And then, I'm hoping that PDA members around the country will look to this as a model for things that can happen in their states. And I and others would be so happy to advise and help and do whatever we can to proliferate these bills making plans for diversification of economies at the state level. As things are completely dysfunctional at the federal level, we need to look to the state level to create models for what can happen at the federal level. And on that point, when I was here describing this Connecticut bill, Congressman Ellison responded, "We need to do that at the national level." And so I drafted a sketch of what such a bill could look like. And now Congressman Ellison's staff and 4 other offices are working on it and are going to be looking for, sponsors and supporters across the aisle. I'm not sure who they are going to get, but that's where that stands, and I will keep you updated on that. I guess the other thing I wanted to talk about was some good news on the federal level of federal help for defense-dependent communities to create their own plans to diversify their economies. So there's an office, it's in the Pentagon, it's called the Office of Economic Adjustment. It has nothing to do with war fighting. Its sole purpose is to help communities diversify their economic bases. And in recent years, the work of this office has been wholly focused on base closure redevelopment, for the obvious reason that nobody has been interested in defense contracting dependent community transition. But now they are. So I worked up a little fact sheet describing this program at the Office of Economic Adjustment in the Pentagon, and I went to see them. And the good news is that the Obama administration really wants to ramp up this program, wants to give it new money, and wants it to be the point of contact for a range of other federal assistance for communities that want to make this transition. And so on this flyer is a map of where the primary manufacturing locations for the C-17 transport plane were in 2010. By 2015, all these little flags will be gone because the C-17 is finally being shut down. And these little flags are going to be added by communities, many more communities that are going to be affected by other defense cancellations as the defense downsizing ramps up. And so there are going to be opportunities all over the country for coalitions led by public officials and involving, labor unions, community groups, everybody here really, to work on transition plans for those communities. There are links on this page to these 2 programs. They're non-competitive planning grants, which is to say if you meet a really low threshold for defense dependency, somewhere between 2 to 3% of your workforce is defense dependent, you will qualify for one of these planning grants. And so my pitch is that we've got to make sure this money gets spent and it gets spent well and constructively, and that we build some models of community transition away from defense dependency toward helping these communities and workers build things that the country actually needs. The one other thing, 20 seconds, I want to say, is that IPS this weekend is turning 50. And there is going to be this extravaganza throughout the weekend, including a whole range of free workshops, which are right in PDA's wheelhouse. They're about movement building. They're about trade policy, they're about inequality, they're about the national security state. I am, Lord help me, moderating a panel in which Seymour Hersh is going to be talking, and moderating him is going to be an interesting proposition, but it's going to be great. So I know some people here are going to be coming, and I would love to see all of you here. So thanks very much.
1 second, we have to thank Miriam first and applaud and say, wasn't that great? And thank her for that. Some of the, for folks that are watching and maybe new to this discussion, it's very important that we bring you up to speed. Miriam indicated early on we had a meeting with Congressman Ellison here, and there's a YouTube on the PDA site to go to in which Miriam is dialoguing with the congressman that led to some of this stuff. Before I let you jump in, Judith, real quick, again, for folks that are watching, where are websites they can go to get the information about this weekend for people in the greater DC area? And where can they go to get that flyer that you just passed around? Tell those folks in that camera.
Yeah, for the festival this weekend, go to ips-dc.org, and it's all up there, the whole program. And I think for the moment, for this flyer, I'm going to have to get it to Tim, and Tim is going to have to get it to you.
I'll get it to them, I promise. Judith, you wanted to make a comment?
I just wanted to add that PDA, there's such a great opportunity for you to get in on the ground floor in this new movement that we're building to convert dependence on defense contracts to actually creating jobs in our communities that are sustainable and green and produce things that we really, really need. Through the might of the great work that Marion Pemberton has been doing and Joe Comerford at the National Priorities Project and Peace Action, we are actually beginning to create models on the local level. And this state bill that passed in Connecticut, now in Maryland there's interest. Well, as of 2 weeks ago, we have 4 state legislators in the state of Wisconsin who's already been hit with layoffs in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, who are now interested in introducing a bill. We have interest on the part of the president of the state assembly in Ohio, and we have interest in Georgia. And so the labor connection and building support by labor, from labor, for these kind of state bills is critical, and PDA has a great role to play. We are also, National Priorities Project and Peace Action, we've created Move the Money trainings, move the money from wars and weapons to fund jobs and our communities. And so in these same states, Wisconsin, Ohio, New Hampshire, North Carolina, we are planning these trainings so we could really use PDA's help in getting these bills off the ground, but also in promoting these trainings that can bring together labor, community, and peace groups to really drill down on the federal budget and the significance of the Pentagon taking 57% every year of our annual discretionary spending.
Thanks, Jim. One of the things folks that are watching and people here in the room know, PD, a lot of our work's done through what we call issue organizing teams. Mark over in the corner leads our efforts on our end war and redirecting military spending to meet human needs as part of our healthcare, not warfare campaign. We had the call last night following the panel, the teach-in that Judith talked about. Steve Cobble to my left, who's part of our national PDA team. We're going to ask him to close up this segment, and then we're going to go, as part of our healthcare, not warfare, we're going to move over to the healthcare piece in a minute. But Steve's going to wrap it up for us, and then we're, since we started hitting the ground running, we're going to do introductions again. So get ready for that, and we're going to keep the live feed going. But to wrap it up, Steve.
So one of the things that PDAers should be thinking about as we think about Washington, and it was true in the Syria case, and Judith and Phyllis spearheaded a very effective coalition that worked with a lot of groups that kept their eyes on the prize of denying the bombing in the Congress. But if you think to the Federal Reserve audit a couple years ago, to the military cuts when we were fighting the sequester battle, to the question of raising up of who's going to vote on a constitutional amendment that corporations are not people, if that ever gets the floor, to the NSA fight, to what happened in Syria, and what if we have to stop a bombing of Iran, what you see is different from the normal political perception of what Washington's like. They normally say politics is on a line that goes from, PDA over to the Tea Party, right? The left to the right. But And there's a whole set of issues in which the politics is much more like a horseshoe, where PDA's up on the left spike of the horseshoe and the Tea Party crowd is up on the right spike, and it's closer across the top of the horseshoe than it is around to the top to the bottom, which is the part that gets the most money from Wall Street. So there's a different dynamic on that set of issues than on a lot of the social issues or labor issues or those things. And we need to be cognizant of which one of those models are our fights fitting into, because one of the things that Judith could probably teach some lessons to the TPP folks, which Mark was just talking about, is if they're going to defeat fast track, it's going to be the left part of the horseshoe and the right part of the horseshoe. And some of the things we did on Syria could be helpful to them. So not every issue fits in that. It's a special class, but it is an important class of issues in which you're seeing a new dynamic of groups that don't really talk to each other running on roughly parallel tracks for widely different reasons. And that's a different kind of politics. And PDA's at the forefront because we're up on the left part of this spike of the horseshoe.
Thanks, Steve. So if we thank Judith, Miriam, Steve, we're going to bring up our other side of our panel now on healthcare, not warfare. While we do that, we wanted to do introductions. We began earlier. Thanks, you guys. We began with the congressman arriving, and we didn't do the introductions for those folks at home. So while Mark Dudzik and Social Security Works makes her way to the table, and Laura from NNU, please come up to the table while we do introductions. Let folks know who you are, and there's your camera. Thanks, real quick. Thanks, welcome.
I'm Dave Palmer from Public Citizen Congress Watch on Healthcare.
And Jane Stoke, and I work with a group of Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, doing social justice advocacy.
Remember to speak up a little louder. They complain if they don't hear you back home.
I'm Mark Levin from PDA. Tim already mentioned that I work on the End War and Occupations group.
Hi, my name is Ashley Bender from Public Citizens Congress Watch.
Jenny Perino from Congressman John Conyers' office.
Are you Chapter 676 today?
Both.
Both. We'll come to the table. Come to the table.
Judith LeBlanc. Judith LeBlanc, Field Director from Peace Action.
Andrea Miller, PDA.
Kelly Johnson, PDA, Western Massachusetts.
And Miriam, who you met. Thank you, Miriam.
Chris Townsend, I'm the Washington representative for UE, the United Electrical Workers.
This really works well. We get a nice cut from NSA by doing this too. Saves them some tape.
Bianca Blomquist with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union.
Steve Cobble and John Lennon would have been 73 today.
Cole Stangler from Indies Times Magazine.
Steve Schaff, Vice Chair Emeritus, PDA.
Liz Schuster, Legislative and Policy Analyst for Food and Water Watch.
Stephen Spitz, PDA.
Len Mel, Jobs for All campaign.
Jessica Devereaux, Capitol Hill correspondent for the Real News Network.
Melinda St. Louis from Public Citizens Global Trade Watch Division.
And We Act Radio for being here. Peter and Fred, thank you. And if those contributions keep coming in, we'll have 2 mics next month, and we won't trip anybody up. Folks want to pass the mic around and introduce yourselves at the table. We're shifting those of you back at home. We've done the warfare. Now we're going to shift to healthcare. Lots of important information we want to share with everybody. So again, tell them what you're here. You can put it here and pass it around.
Laura McCleary, National Nurses United.
Molly Shexfield, Social Security Works.
I'm Mark Dudzik, Labor Campaign for Single Payer.
And again, Jenny Perino with Congressman John Conyers' office. He's the lead sponsor of HR 676.
All right. Thanks, everybody. If we could, then we want to begin and talk a little bit about what Mark is going to kick us off with on the big news coming out of the AFL-CIO. Many of us weren't privy. We're in there. A lot of good news to report there for those of us on the single payer fight. Our purpose here at the table is to talk about specifically no cuts on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We want single payer. We want to get back to our eyes on the prize, and we're going to do inside outside. We've got folks that are working both in the Hill and those of us working with the street heat. And we're going to begin again with Mark Dudzik from Labor for Single Payer. Mark?
Well, thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. It's great to see how strong these progressive roundtables have gotten over the last few months. I really think that PDA is doing a real service to the progressive community by bringing us together, and I really appreciate the work that you've done. I also would be remiss to not mention that I spent the weekend in Nashville with Tim, where he received the Marilyn Clement Healthcare Justice Award from Healthcare Now. It's a real tribute to the work that Tim and PDA has done on single-payer healthcare for all. And those of us in this fight really appreciate the support that we've gotten from PDA on these issues. So I was at the AFL-CIO convention about a month ago. It was it's a very interesting convention. The theme of the convention was to try to think of a way to reorient the labor movement into the broader progressive communities and move away from just the sort of the traditional structures of the labor movement, find ways to integrate into the organizations, the work that's being done by people organizing for immigrant rights and people organizing low-wage workers in areas where it's virtually illegal to think of how you could get formal union recognition, student organizing, all of these related communities. And there was some attempts to create some structural changes in the AFL-CIO to integrate that work directly into the work of the labor movement. And we'll see how that develops over time. This is a very complex situation, and the movement is under a lot of attack, as is the whole progressive movement. But I was encouraged that there were attempts to do this. I was also really inspired by a lot of the diverse and young people who came to the convention to participate in its activities. I was there to talk about labor's work in single-payer health care. There was a very kind of an interesting experience. We've basically won the battle of ideas in the AFL-CIO, which has been a sort of a 10-year fight to turn this giant freighter around in the right direction again and have it moving towards a single-payer solution to the healthcare crisis. What the convention really struggled with is a number of the negative consequences that the Affordable Care Act will have on healthcare benefits enjoyed by a lot of working families through union contracts and particularly through what's called multi-employer plans, which are unique to union workplaces, but they're plans that cover particularly workers who don't work for one single employer, who move around employment, as in the construction industry, or who work casual hours. They might work 6 months and then be out of work for 3 months and then work again. And it's basically funds that all employers under a union contract or in an industry pay into. It's a nonprofit fund, and then it provides stable, continued, uninterrupted benefits for workers who participate in that fund and meet the basic qualifications of that fund. So it's sort of like what we think healthcare ought to be all about. In terms of if you really designed a decent healthcare system. And yet these funds may be driven out of existence by certain provisions of the Affordable Care Act and the way that the Obama administration is interpreting the Affordable Care Act to apply to these funds. And I don't want to bore you in all of the details of that, but basically it's going to really create a real competitive disadvantage for these funds. And in many industries, there's incentives for employers to actually leave the funds and either dump their workers onto the subsidized exchanges or to find ways to get tax subsidies to ensure their own groups of workers who may be younger and healthier than the other workers in these funds. So there's a real existential crisis there. And there was a real debate about what to do about that and how to relate it to the broader health care fights. And there were two resolutions that bore on the broad issues of healthcare and healthcare justice. First resolution was not particularly controversial. It was about protecting and expanding Medicare benefits, and it really raised the warning of exactly what we're now confronting, the potential that the grand bargain is going to raise its ugly head again, that it's going to result in cuts in Medicare, which is a fundamental social safety net program. And the AFL-CIO put itself on record as opposing any kind of cost shifting or privatization proposals or anything that would undercut or undermine Medicare. And that concluded with a statement that instead of looking for ways to destroy Medicare, we must build on its experience as a single-payer program, demonstrating that single-payer is the most cost-effective and equitable way to provide quality health care, which is basically how we've been trying to frame the issue, that the fight to protect these benefits is a fight ultimately to win single-payer for everybody. So that resolution passed. The second resolution actually was a bill, mostly a bill of particulars with problems that unions are having and will have with the Affordable Care Act, and basically demanding that some actions take place, both in terms of the administration, where they can give some regulatory relief to the unions, and secondly, in terms of perhaps some legislative fixes to the Affordable Care Act. So again, this was put in the context of understanding that the ultimate goal of the labor movement is a single-payer healthcare system. So it's very kind of interesting, the changes that have taken place since 2009, which was the last AFL-CIO convention, where we really had to use some sharp elbows to kind of assert that, single payer has got, whatever people are going to do or not going to do in terms of supporting the Affordable Care Act in the immediate future, that we have to understand that the long-term goal is to fight for a single-payer solution, and that we have to move resources into that project. This time around, everybody was like, we should have had single payer. If we didn't have single payer, we wouldn't be dealing with these things, and of course, single payer is the best way to go. So the battle of ideas has been won. The question now is how to move forward, to not circle the wagon around these crises, or respond in a negative way. There are some unions that wanted to call for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act because of all the adverse consequences. We in the Labor Campaign for Single Payer think that would be an unmitigated disaster. It would destroy the hope of effective health care reform. It would alienate us from the very allies we need to be working with to advance the cause of health care justice and to rebuild a revitalized labor movement. So we think single payer now is back in the game as a central solution to where to move forward. And, I think there's tremendous organizing opportunity right now because of this. We're meeting this weekend in St. Louis. We're having an expanded steering committee meeting and trying to figure out what the strategic possibilities are for us in this new era. And, I'm very positive that we've come out of this convention with a much deeper understanding of why the fight for single-payer health care, Medicare for all, has to be a central part of labor's strategy.
Are we okay on the feed? I'm getting people are saying they're losing the feed. As far as you know, we're okay? I just got a bunch of quick answers. All right. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Mark, thank you. A couple of housekeeping measures then before we turn it over. As Mark indicated, our commitment will continue to be 676. You're going to hear from Jenny in a moment from Congressman Conyers' office. But to remind those of you who are watching, sometimes when you're watching at home, you feel a little isolated and can't be part of what's going on sometimes. But most importantly, this coming Wednesday, we're having a national call-in day for single payer. get our eyes on the prize, get back to work, remind members of Congress that they messed it up when they started talking public option, let alone affordable care. As Mark had indicated, had we stayed on the track for single payer, how better we would have been. So in this climate, we're encouraging everybody to please pick up your phone on Wednesday and call your member of Congress. Those of you who can take a half hour and go to the office, we will be delivering letters, dedicated letters specifically around 676 and legislation that allows states to move forward on single payer. We're waiting on Senator Bernie Sanders to help us on the Senate side. If that's something that interests you, we meet PDA, our issue organizing team, Dr. Bill Honigman and Kurt Bateman. They meet on virtual phone call just as our end occupation. Visit the website. Andrea is here, you'll hear from later, can give you some more sites on where you can go within our website to be part of those conversations. But as we move into this conversation now, as Mark indicated, keep our eyes on the prize, no grand bargain. Don't cut Social Security, no Medicare, Medicaid. How's that for a segue?
Perfect.
Please introduce yourself.
Perfect segue. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Molly Chexfield. I'm here from Social Security Works, and thank you so much for having us. So I'm here to, I'll start off with a messaging piece, just since that was such a great segue. So again, as Tim just said, we're all about passing a clean CR, raising the debt ceiling, and no grand bargain, as has been said by both Mark and Stephen earlier. The chain CPI is potentially in the conversation. It's potentially a part of the so-called grand bargain. We've been seeing a lot of press coming out recently over the past week or so about the potential of having a conversation on the Hill of different members saying that they're interested in a grand bargain. And we just want to make sure that that message is coming out right now, that we are very much opposed to a grand bargain in any type of Social Security, Medicare or Medicaid cuts, specifically, especially when the average Social Security benefit is only $15,000. Having cuts to that very modest amount of income is just not good at all for the American people. So we want to make sure that that message is pushed, as was said earlier, having conversations with members of Congress and just letting them know that constituents don't want their members to be interested in a grand bargain. Pushing against it any way that we can is very good. And this message is not only coming from Social Security Works, it's obviously coming from the AFL and other labor groups as well. And just a bit of an update about what's been going on with Social Security Works and our coalition recently. Last week, on the 3rd, we had a congressional chain against the chain CPI, and that was a very great event. We had over 20 members of Congress show up, including Representative Pocan and McGovern, and this is opposing the chain CPI. They gave great speeches. We had over 200 folks show up and also oppose the chain CPI. At the end of the event, after the messages, after the members spoke, we had folks actually linking arms, and it was a very good visual in front of the Capitol. We obviously already had a lot of press there, so a lot of great press hits, and this all came out of the events that occurred in July with the Alliance for Retired Americans. They put together a great day of action at over 50 places around the country with over 2,000 people who were a part of it, and this was again. People throughout the country had linked arms just opposing the chain CPI. We decided to mirror that and then create this congressional chain against the chain CPI, which we had last week. We actually have, I think it was page 20 of Politico. There's a picture of that from last week. And then as far as legislative update, we had Representative Sanchez from California. A couple of weeks ago, over the past month, she introduced the companion bill to the Harkin bill in the Senate. So in the House, it's H.R. 3118, and this is the Strengthening Social Security Act of 2013. So this expands Social Security benefits. We're obviously opposed to Social Security benefits, but why not include expanding Social Security benefits as well as protecting benefits? So that currently has 36 co-sponsors.
And that's Linda, not Loretta, when you talk.
Correct. Linda, yes.
You must know your sisters for the mid, sure. Thank you, Molly. As we said earlier today, moving from defense to offense, we're spending a lot of time on defense, and probably the best piece out of our playbook right now to move to offense is the Robin Hood tax. So we're going to ask Laura to talk a little bit about that, but also we would be remiss if we don't mention once again National Nurses United for their unwavering support on the single payer front. As Mark indicated, we are with the nurses at Healthcare Now, and they'll be helping us on the phone in. So Laura, we're all yours. Thank you. Let your stand there. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, of course, we're completely opposed to the change CPI and cuts to Social Security and Medicare and our other social obligations. We're actually going to send a letter to House Energy and Commerce about a bill that would also cut social benefits that came out of that committee earlier, and we'll be sharing that with PDA and with Social Security Works. And we're big supporters on single payer and always have been. So I did want to say a little bit about our work on the Robin Hood tax. We had a terrific action in New York. On September 17th, we had 2,500 people march in the streets in Midtown between an area near the UN, which was there. Everyone from the UN was there in honor of revisiting the UN's Millennial Development Goals, which have to do with global poverty and the austerity debate. And we marched in front of J.P. Morgan, and we had a terrific turnout from a lot of the labor organizations, environmental groups, housing, student debt, HIV/AIDS groups, and other progressive organizations. We had some folks get arrested, which is always including lawmakers from the State House in Albany. And then we had Sweet Honey in the Rock play at the end, which was a really sweet kind of celebration. It was a very fun, high-energy event right there in the lap of Wall Street and in front of many of the investment banks. It felt really good to sort of take the fight to them. And then we're planning an event highlighting our support for the Inclusive Prosperity Act, which is a bill from Representative Keith Ellison. Representative Conyers also has a jobs bill that features a financial transaction tax, which we are supporting. On Representative Ellison's bill is H.R. 1579. It would raise somewhere between $180 billion to $300 billion a year in revenues from a tiny tax on Wall Street transactions, about 0.5 for stocks and lower levels for bonds and derivatives. The reason why we really think this is a breakthrough idea is that we think that people are hungry not only for folks that stand up to these predictable budget crises and resist cuts to our social obligations, but want a solution. They want to know what is the next thing, what's the big idea that's going to get us out of this continual lurching from budget crisis to budget crisis, out of this generated scarcity here in Washington. And we think that the financial transaction tax is a win-win. It would raise these record levels of revenues for our needed social obligations, helping us address all of these issues like climate, like the need for funding for HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment, like the need for housing, for student debt relief, all of these different things that would provide ample funds to accomplish. It would also regulate Wall Street transactions in a way that's beneficial for the overall economy, because it would raise the costs of churning, that is, these high frequency trades or algorithmic or computer driven trades that actually provide no real value to the economy. The purpose of Wall Street, as we all know, is to channel capital into productive purposes. This kind of activity by Wall Street, which is sort of taken over by this computer and algorithmic trading, not only disfavors ordinary investors, but it also just means that a lot of our time and energy is spent on totally unproductive uses of our financial attention. So at the end of October, the 29th and 30th, we will be having a day of action on the 30th for call-ins for folks from the field, and we'll have patch-throughs to members of Congress to urge them to get on to the bill. We're also going to have a teach-in on the 29th here in Washington. Jim Hightower, an outspoken progressive, is going to speak. Laura Flanders from Grit TV is going to interview Bob Pollin, who is the UMass economist who blew up the austerity debate based on the Excel spreadsheet error that one of his graduate students found in the middle of the summer. We're doing workshops, and we'll hear from leaders of organizations, and we're having a cocktail party because, you need to have a drink when you look at Washington these days. And then on the 30th, we're doing a march to the Capitol in the morning and a briefing with Hill staff. Representative Conyers, Representative Ellison will both be there, as well as other members of Congress have been invited. And we'll hear from Annie Podimata, who's coming on an official visit from the European Parliament. She is a Greek member of the European Parliament who's been leading the fight for the financial transaction tax in Europe, and she's going to debunk the myth that the European FTT is on the ropes for Hill staff. We'll also hear from Lynn Stout, who is a Cornell law professor, who is the leading issue area expert on financial transaction taxes, and Wally Turbeville, who's a Goldman Sachs trader now at Demos, who will talk about the destructive nature of these computer-driven trades and the beneficial effect of a financial transaction tax. And then we're going to do a lobby day with everyone that's in town. We expect about 200 people to come, some PDA members included. And for the field, we'll be webcasting both the Laura Flanders interview with Bob Poland and the briefing on the Hill on the 30th in that morning. We'll have them both as live casts and as recorded events so anyone can watch them. And then on the 30th, as I mentioned, we'll do the call-in and day of action. So we invite you to use our patch-through number. We'll work with PDA to get that information out to you and make sure that you place calls on the 30th to urge members to co-sponsor HR 1579. So that's the presentation on the Robin Hood. I hope that we get a high level of interest in both the conference and in field participation on those events. I really do think this is a breakthrough idea.
We'll be there. PDA National's coming. Those of you who are watching, I know Mary Ellen in New Jersey, Walt out in Pennsylvania, make plans to be with us again. The dates are?
October 29th and 30th here in Washington.
All right. Thank you. As we said, we moved from inside to outside. We're going to go to the inside now. You've heard some great street heat that's coming up, but some of the most important work that's going on that many of you don't know about that are watching the live feed are those aides that are working with the members of Congress that are making a difference for us and helping us in the work that we do. You've met many of them through our coming together on the live feeds thus far, and certainly when you call, when Connor gets us organized, our deputy director, when you call for our letter drop campaign, we've been privileged to have a number of the staffers who've been with us. One of those, you'll recognize her voice. Now you get to put the voice with the face, is Jenny. Jenny is with Congressmember Conyers' office. She spins two plates simultaneously. She's working both on 676 as well as Congressman Conyers' jobs bill. I do want to, as I bring Jenny on, share with folks that we're busy out in New York. A shout out to IATSE, to Bobby Score, who's working right now to bring Congressman Conyers back to New York, where the Central Labor Council just endorsed 676. Jenny, we're all yours.
If I can just segue off of what some of my colleagues have said, Mr. Conyers is obviously very excited to see ACA implemented. It obviously is a shortcoming in some regards, but after serving for 49 years and finally achieving some level of healthcare reform, he is happy to see the conversation started. I will say that we have received many of PDA and everyone else's calls, encouraging us to not stop and forget about HR 676, and I have taken many of those, so thank you for calling us frequently. I will also say that Mr. Conyers, every time he talks about the Affordable Care Act implementation, he never forgets to mention that it doesn't go far enough and that he pushes HR 676 religiously. I mean, it has been his baby for about half of his career, if not longer, and so it continues to be that high level of a priority for him. So we have not given up just because ACA is being implemented, but we do see it as a nice stepping stone, at least in the right direction. That being said, we are doing a lot, trying to organize different town hall events to talk about healthcare, to talk about the need and the shortcomings of what ACA, or the highlights of what ACA is, but also the shortcomings of where it is missing the mark. So we're having the conversations in our district and here in the district as well. So both districts rather. On the jobs front, though, I'm excited to say that we have just reached 50 co-sponsors. So HR 1000 is very much moving ahead. I guess that would be 1/4 of our Democratic caucus because we haven't gotten any Republicans on board yet, go figure. But we have high hopes that, as we continue to push the message for needing jobs, that people will realize that this needs to be in the conversation. I mean, there are still, at minimum, 12 million Americans that are unemployed, another 14 million that are underemployed, and you look at the youth job crisis, and it's just appalling. I mean, you think about the long-term consequences of what this means. We're really setting up the next generation to be significantly behind where they deserve to be and should be. So jobs is obviously a high priority for the congressman, as we think it should be for all of Washington, D.C., and we're just amazed that it's really not gotten any airwaves in the last couple of months. So I thank you all for what you guys do to support both 676 and H.R. 1000. That's our jobs bill. We will be participating with Laura and NNU at the end of the month with their push for FTTs, because as Laura mentioned, jobs is one way that the FTT could fund. We figure that given current trading levels, we could create up to 8 million jobs in the first 2 years if H.R. 1000 was actually enacted. And that would go a significant way to denting the higher rates of unemployment and the consistently high rates of unemployment. I mean, you look at some populations, and even when we are in good times, they're not. So it's something that really should be in the conversation overall. So Mr. Conyers is, he's pushing long hours and working hard to end this shutdown, but he is not forgetting about his legislative priorities. So thank you all.
Jenny, thank you. That concludes our healthcare and warfare. Laura, NNU, Molly, Social Security Works. Jenny, thank the Congressman for us. Mark, for all your work on the labor front. Thank you so much. We're going to keep this on time. We're about 15 minutes out. We've got two other folks, and then we want to give those of you who have not had an opportunity. As I said when we began, Andrea Miller needs no introduction for anybody in the PDA community. Andrea's been out front helping us to transition our website. Be watching it in the coming days. Some big stuff going on. Andrea's been very busy. But now we're going to ask her to put on her issue organizing team. Again, those of you who are new to watching, we're organized through issue organizing teams. You've heard from End Occupation. You've heard from Healthcare, Not Warfare. You're going to hear from the environmental one in a moment. You're going to hear from the corporate stand. But right now, we want Andrea to share with you a little bit of the excitement and some of the work she's been doing on her issue organizing team, and hopefully to involve you in that. Andrea.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Tim. As Tim said, I'm Andrea Miller, and I work with the ERA 3 state team. So we are working very, very hard to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. It is merely stalled. It is not dead. It has been stalled for roughly 30 years. And one of the things that we've realized about this particular piece of legislation is on constitutional amendments, since Congress is responsible for adding deadlines and they have extended the deadline, they also have the legal authority to completely remove the deadline. And we also discovered we are very, very good at math, and we understand that getting 3 additional states to the 35 to reach the number of 38 states that we need for ratification is a much smaller number than starting over and attempting to get 38 states. So we are specifically working in that arena. At the present time, our legislation is moving. Right now in the Senate, our bill, SJ-Res 15, currently has 31 co-sponsors, and our bill in the House yesterday, HJ-Res 43, just got 1 additional co-sponsor, so we are at 89. It is our goal by the end of 2013 to have 100 co-sponsors on this bill. This would be the greatest number of co-sponsors we have ever had in history on 3-state strategy legislation. Additionally, we are working with activists in the unratified states to actually bring legislation. And at this point, we know of 5 states that will be bringing Equal Rights Amendment legislation to ratify in at least 5, if not 6 states. And there will probably be more. So we are very, very active. Our next call that will be coming up will be on the 4th Monday of the month. So you can get information about all of PDA's issue teams on our national site, which is www.pdamerica.org. And what we've done is, for people who may have visited our site a lot before, you're now going to notice our site now is really all about us as opposed to about other people, many of whom we didn't know. So our website now is all about PDA and the activists and team members and the board members that actually make up this organization. For activists that are very interested in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and women activists are very interested in the TPP because the labor component, of course, hurts women since we only earn 77 cents to a man's dollar. There is now a map on the national site where you can go and you can see what opposition, if any, has your legislator made to either Fast Track or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a brand new map that we don't even have on the front page yet, but it's on the Healthcare Human Rights team, where you can actually go and you can see what's the level of activity in states moving around the issue of Medicare for all single payer. And we also are listing all of the representatives who currently have signed on to HR 676. So a lot of really exciting things going on the website. And of course, the very first map where we really learned how to do this, the map showing the unratified versus the ratified states on the ERA. And you can also look and see, has your legislator agreed to co-sponsor? Now, the ladies that work with me on my team are excellent in social media. So we do a tremendous amount of our advocacy using Twitter. So for every member of Congress on each one of these maps, their live Twitter handles are there. And we also are giving you sample tweets. So if you're not really used to Twitter, we actually give you tweets. They need to be 140 characters. We've worked out about 10 of them on the map pages. You can click on your representative's name and send them that tweet. As a matter of fact, you can click on every representative's name and send it to all of them. That's what we do.
Has that ever happened?
Yeah. Yes. And we have tools. So yes, we send out a lot of tweets. And it really does work. What we like about Twitter is Twitter is very public. So when you send out a tweet, not only does the representative see it, but anybody who goes to the representative's page, they also see it. And it's a very good way to notify other people that are their constituents about your particular issue. So every Tuesday, there's a Twitter storm on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we work with that. Hopefully soon we'll see Twitter storms on the jobs bill and also on the single-payer HR 676. So thank you. Just wanted to update everybody. There is so much that's going on at PDA.
Thank you, Andrea. Those of you out on the West Coast, Andrea's going to be out with our national team. We're going to be out on the 20th and 21st, as if you haven't heard enough about John Nichols yet. We're going to be back out with John Nichols and Bob Betesdek with their book tour, and Andrea will be out on the West Coast to help our PDA activists access these tools. Two final presentations. Those of you who watched last month, remember that Russell Green, who runs our issue organizing team and doing all of the work around the carbon tax and around fracking and so forth, brought his team with us last month. Russell couldn't get back here. He's out on the West Coast, but he'll be with us on the 20th and the 21st. But one of the groups that we've been working very closely because of the work of Russell and the issue organizing team has been Food and Water Watch. And Elizabeth is here real quick to share with us some quick information about what they're up to. And then we've got Stephen Spitz, and we're almost there. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us here. I just wanted to, we're working on the TPP stuff and the other stuff that's been mentioned, the Robin Hood tax. But the thing I wanted to flag for everyone today is the global frack down, our second one, which is going to be October 19th, 2013. So it's coming up, and there's information here. What we're trying to do is get communities to organize events, local events in their communities. And this is a packet of information that tells you how to do that you can access from our website. Last year, we had 200 communities in over 20 countries organize actions to unite against these dirty fossil fuels and calling for clean, renewable energy.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Spread the word. The last one, then, if we could, thank you, is our issue organizing team that does our corporate accountability. You heard from both Congress members, Pocan and McGovern, earlier about their amendments and the work that they're doing. PDA has been very instrumental in that. You also heard Congressman McGovern talk about the big press conference yesterday in front of the Supreme Court. So we'd like to call up Steve Cobble, who you met earlier, and Stephen Spitz, who's helping to lead that IoT, just to update us real quick before we close out the day then on our issue organizing team. These are the folks that are doing the work around corporate accountability. Stephen and Steve.
Thank you, Tim. I wanted to start out by saying that I attended yesterday's oral argument in the Supreme Court in the McCutcheon case, and I'll just leave one frightening thought with you from that oral argument, and that is Justice Scalia suggested that now that there are no caps due to Citizens United on independent expenditures of money, it would be inconsistent and harmful to the political parties if we continue to have caps on the amount of money that people can give to candidates and political parties. So they're using their, they started down a ridiculous road, but we have to continue down this road. Otherwise, the political parties and candidates will suffer, and all the money will now go to the super PACs. So this is the logic they're now pursuing, and that seemed to gain if not all, the rest of the 5 votes. There is some question. Justice Roberts threw in a little interesting curveball where he was questioning about some less restrictive alternative. So maybe he's thinking of possibly, bailing out of a broader decision. But what this would do is continue the path down to allowing corporations and rich individuals to spend as much money as possible to further diminish the voice of regular people. And the solution, given what's likely an outcome of this case, is a constitutional amendment. PDA supports the constitutional amendments that have been introduced by Congressman McGovern, H.R. 20 and 21, as well as the one Representative Nolan has represented, H.R. 29. And also there are bills in the Senate. Senator Udall and Tester have introduced bills, and we are working to try to increase the co-sponsorship of those bills. We have our calls on the 4th Wednesday of every month, so at 9 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Cobble. Watch that stand.
And I'll just close by saying, while Steve was inside, I was outside with a rally on McCutcheon, and I spoke for a minute and just pointed out to the crowd that in the 3.5 years since Citizens United, many of you, Steve's been involved, lots of people in this room, we've built a movement now that has gotten 16 states to say they want a constitutional amendment to roll back Citizens United, 500 cities and towns, 99 House members, 27 senators, a president, and 3/4 of the American public. In some ways, this is the most significant grassroots movement going on in the country, is about this question of whether money is speech, and of course that's idiotic, and whether corporations are people, and of course that's idiotic. But inside the rarefied halls of the Supreme Court, they have a parallel universe where those things make sense. We need to break that down. We need to keep the movement going. It is the movement that will eventually change this, whether by passing a constitutional amendment bill or several of them, as has happened in other progressive eras, or by building the momentum so that when the court finally changes its attitude, it is axiomatic that they are going to roll back Buckley, roll back Citizens United, and if we really do our job right, roll all the way back to the Santa Clara decision, which is the one that perverted the 14th Amendment, an amendment originally put in to protect freed slaves, and at a time that the Supreme Court was protecting Jim Crow instead, they snuck in the idea that a corporation is a person. It's probably the most vile misinterpretation of congressional intent in the history of this country. And it's got some competition, but that's probably up there number one. And it should not stand. The fact that it's 125 years old or something like that is irrelevant to the fact that it never really should have been there in the first place. It was snuck in, and it's been rejected by some of our greatest constitutional theorists on the court, and only lately has it begun to be accepted as a reality by people who should know better. PDA's been at the forefront of that fight and will continue to be, and many of you who are watching, I know, are in on this too. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Last night when we, thank you, Steve. Thanks, Stephen. Last night when we were all here rehearsing, we were going to wonder if we'd come in right on time at 3 o'clock, and here we are hitting our marks. A couple of just measures we want to thank before we close it out. Again, those of you hopefully who are new to PDA and to our larger progressive movement, to remind everybody of our inside-outside strategy. Today will work only if you take the energy and the work that's being done here in Washington back to your community. We in PDA are proud to be part of a larger progressive movement. You've heard from many organizations today that we're proud to work with. We ourselves cannot do it alone, only working collectively and together. And along those spirit, we want to thank We Act Radio. Without them, we wouldn't have had the live feed today, and tripled, if not, hopefully got a few other people watching today. So let's do a shout out to We Act Radio. Peter and Troy, thank you. We're getting better on the mic. We thank you for that. And then again, this work, if we don't leave here committed to move it forward, this Friday, Connor, our deputy director, will be organizing us for a phone call. We'll hear from staffers on the Hill on where we are with the shutdown and making plans for our letter drops. Remember our goal next Wednesday to visit members of Congress in their district offices on these specific issues. We measure our growth, our benchmark, and our deliverables by how many new co-sponsors we get. So you heard everybody today speaking proudly on the number of co-sponsors. We're not naive enough to know that we will not pass a lot of this legislation this coming session. What we are confident in is that we will build this movement and to grow this movement. So again, we thank everybody who watched on the live feed. If you want more information, as Andrea said, watch the website, pdamerica.org, as we begin the transition to grow PDA as part of the larger progressive community. And again, we thank you. If you still haven't had enough, tune in on Tom Hartman. We're heading over there in the next hour. We'll be on the Tom Hartman Show to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
There is no one else that can speak for you the way that the PDA does. There's no other organization that fills this niche. And you know, you're watching today, you all are here today, because you're good people. You're people who care about what's right, you care about your neighbors, you care about people in need. You care about each other, and that makes you special in a way. Everyone in this room is here today because of that reason. If you were here today to just give some latitude to that spark within you of empathy, that thing that makes you actually different from the soulless, selfish people on the other side, the thing that makes you see somebody in need and say, gee, I wish I could help, then you're part of the PDA. And you need to support the PDA so the PDA can go out day in and day out and do the things that you're too busy to do for yourself. There really is no alternative because we need a little bit of cash just to keep this thing going. You know, just in order to be able to pay the email bill turns out to be an expensive thing. In our campaign, it's a couple of $1,000s each month. So there is a sort of a practical need for your $20, your $25, your $50, whatever it might be. It's unavoidable. It's the cost of doing the business of America, the cost of doing the business of what's right, what's good. And that's why you need to contribute to the PDA. So go to pdamerica.org and make your contribution. You know, it's that simple. You have to put your money where our mouths are. There is no one else.
time up between sessions.
I'll be very brief because between a rules meeting, an immigration meeting, and something
Another
else.
slow day on the Hill.
So I want to talk just a little bit about the Farm Bill and SNAP. First of all, I want to thank all of you.